Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Once again, as you all know, we had already winded up our course, but this very important lecture was rescheduled due to the busy schedule of our speaker. Um, I would request Dr. Syed Mohammad Hassan to kindly begin the today's lecture with Tilawat-e-Quran. Over to you, Dr. Hassan.
Can we start now?
जी, over to you. आप Tilawat-e-Quran, please, tilawat कर दीजिए. जी, डॉक्टर हसन आप तिलावत कर लीजिए.
Okay. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إذا جاء نصر الله والفتح ورأيت الناس يدخلون في دين الله أفواجا فسبح بحمد ربك واستغفره إنه كان توابا. शुरू अल्लाह के नाम से जो निहायत मेहरबान और रहीम है। जब अल्लाह की मदद आ जाए और फतह नसीब हो जाए और ए नबी सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम तुम देख लो कि लोग फौज दर फौज अल्लाह के दीन में दाखिल हो रहे हैं, तो अपने रब की हम के साथ उसकी तस्बीह करो और उससे मग़फ़िरत की दुआ मांगो, बेशक वो बड़ा तौबा कबूल करने वाला है। सदक़ल्लाहुल अज़ीम।
जज़ाकल्लाह डॉक्टर हसन. और दिस वाज द लास्ट लेक्चर जहां आपकी खिदमत हमने हासिल की है. Now today's lecture, as you all know, dear attendees, that it is a very important topic, and without this subject, this topic, our course is incomplete. So let me introduce you today's speaker. Today's speaker is Dr. Aisha Sheikh. She is FCPS Medicine Fellow of American College of Endocrinology, and she did her fellowship training in diabetes endocrinology and metabolism from Aga Khan University Hospital. And then later, she did her postgraduate diploma in diabetes and endocrinology from UK. At present, Madam is a consultant endocrinologist and is affiliated as a faculty member with the Aga Khan University Hospital and the Medicine Institute of Diabetes, Endocrinology and Metabolism in Karachi, as well as she is a registered tutor at the University of South Wales, UK. Madam has been actively involved in medical education research programs and has several research publications and book chapters to her credit. Madam is at present, she's as because of a keen interest in diabetes and antenatal diabetes and endocrinology, she has played several key roles in the development of different guidelines, and she has been an active member in the development of gestational diabetes recommendations, guidelines, and action plan from the platform of South Asian Federation of Endocrine Societies. And at present, she has launched 2 dissemination programs at national level through the Serendip Hyperglycemia and Pregnancy Project in collaboration with the Society of Obstetrics and Gynecology of Pakistan. And she's also the author of recently published Metabacity Guideline. And she's also, academic director of the currently running BMJ AKU RCP 6-month diabetes certificate course. And at present, there is a second batch which is involved in this course. Madam is a president-elect of the Pakistan Endocrine Society, and in the future years, she will be the president of Pakistan, inshallah, president of Pakistan Endocrine Society, inshallah. She's my mentor, my teacher. That was, a kind of a brief introduction to her because there's a lot to say. But because of the limitation of time, I could only say this much. Before handing over the mic to Madam, I would like to run the pre-lecture questions. I would encourage all the attendees to actively participate in this pre-lecture questions because these are very few and brief and easy for all of you to easily participate and quickly participate. Okay, I'm launching the questions, so quickly attempt them. question number 1 is the following is true for fetal energy source during pregnancy. Option number A is triglycerides and fatty acids. Option number B is ketone bodies, and option number C is amino acids and glucose. Question number 2 is how will you screen for gestational diabetes in early pregnancy? Option number A is fasting plasma glucose. Option number 2 is oral glucose tolerance test with 75 grams with checking the blood sugar at 0, that is fasting, 1 hour and 2 hour. Option number C is hemoglobin A1C. Okay. Question number 3, which of the following long-term complications may occur in the baby of the mother who have gestational diabetes mellitus? Option number A is obesity. Option number B is cancers, and option number C is asthma. Then question number 4, a 20 years old lady, primi gravida, is diagnosed as GDM at 27 weeks of gestation. Her oral glucose tolerance test shows the result of fasting glucose of 96, 1 hour glucose of 175, and 2 hour of 152. You will offer her option number A is basal bolus insulin regime, option number B is metformin, and option number C is medical nutrition therapy. Moving on to the last question, that is question number 5. 20 years old lady, para 1 plus 0, currently 6 weeks postpartum, had gestational diabetes mellitus during pregnancy and was treated with medical nutrition therapy, walk, metformin, and basal insulin. Post delivery, her sugars were normal. She's currently breastfeeding her baby. You will offer her what? Option number A is 75 gram oral glucose tolerance, and this is 0, that is fasting hour and fasting and after 2 hours of 75 gram. Option number B is hemoglobin A1C, and option number C is fasting blood glucose level. So I can see almost 43% of the participants have participated in the polling. I would encourage if this goes on to 70 plus. So the questions are brief and easy. Please, all attendees, please opt them. You may be wrong, but you can always correct yourself, and that's how you learn. So I'm still having, I can still wait for another half a minute before handing over the mic to Madam. So 69%. And there's a lot of variation in the options. This will be interesting. Okay, 78%, excellent. So I think now just for 10 more seconds, and then I'm going to end the question polling. 5 seconds, that's it, okay. I will share the results later and we'll discuss these questions again. So over to you, Dr. Aisha. The lecture is yours. Let's hear from you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalatu wassalamu ala khatamin nabiyyin. I'm really grateful to Zareen for your kind introduction and invitation, and really grateful to Professor Dr. Akhtar Ali Baloch, Dr. Syed Hassan for their kind presence in today's session and for actually formulating this course, which I'm sure had been very beneficial to our endocrine fellows across Pakistan. So let me just share the screen. Okay, so is the screen visible on slideshow mode, Zareen?
Yes, madam, we can see.
Okay, yes. Thank you. 20 minutes, 30 to 40 minutes. Inshallah, we'll try to finish within 40 minutes time. So this is the effect of pregnancy on maternal carbohydrate metabolism. Over here, you can see that this depicts the role of human chorionic somatomyotrophin and the placental growth hormone on the fuel metabolism that is altered during pregnancy. So towards the fetus, you can see glucose and amino acids are preferentially transferred to the fetus, while the maternal metabolism during pregnancy relies mostly on lipolysis, triglycerides, and free fatty acid concentrations. And that is why in routine practice for women who are pregnant, you do not go on screening lipid profile, because those numbers are different during pregnancy, and you do not have to treat dyslipidemias anyway during pregnancy most often. So placenta is considered as the third brain, and there are lots of reasons why it is considered as third brain. Inshallah, next time, sometime when we'll be discussing endocrine challenges in pregnancy, we'll go through this data as well. So these are the diabetogenic hormones of pregnancy. So amongst all these, human placental lactogen, or currently called as the human chorionic somatomammotrope, is mainly the strongest antagonist of pregnancy. And besides this, cortisol, progesterone, prolactin, and growth hormone all contribute to insulin resistance during pregnancy. And you can see the level of the human chorionic somatomammotrophin levels mainly rising after 24 weeks of gestation. And this is the time between 24 to 28 weeks of gestation when you were classically screening these women, pregnant women, for GDMs. And this is the impact on pregnancy that this hormone leads to, where you know that there is massive increments in requirements of insulin need for women, even women who have pre-existing diabetes. So a little bit about history. In 1882, it was first observed that diabetes might appear during pregnancy and cease with the end of the pregnancy. And then in 1952, Jackson reported higher likelihood of previous stillbirth and fetal macrosomias in women with diabetes. And in 1957, the term gestational diabetes was coined. And later on, there's a whole history of how the thresholds were identified for diagnosing diabetes during pregnancy. Since that was a long topic, I'm not covering that aspect in today's talk. So why are we talking about hyperglycemia in pregnancy, and why is it relevant? You know that there is a high risk of maternal and perinatal morbidity and mortality and poor pregnancy outcomes in pregnancies which are complicated by hyperglycemia in pregnancy. And the offspring of GDM pregnancy is at high risk of metabolic problems, including type 2 diabetes in future life. And thus, hyperglycemia in pregnancy identifies women at high future risk of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease as well. And this offers opportunity for primary prevention in this high-risk group of women who are luckily diagnosed as hyperglycemia in pregnancy, where you can intervene in them in the postpartum periods as well. So how do we classify hyperglycemia in pregnancy? So the hyperglycemia that is first detected at any time during pregnancy is classified either as gestational diabetes mellitus or as overt diabetes mellitus in pregnancy. If you may recall that previously this definition was coined for only GDM. So it was used to say that GDM is first detected, any degree of hyperglycemia first detected during pregnancy is classified as GDM. But later on it was modified because of the very fact that classifying these two as separate disorders would mean that this group of women who have over-diabetes mellitus in pregnancy might be the ones who either had pre-existing pre-diabetes or pre-existing type 2 diabetes before pregnancy, but they were not aware of their glycemic status, and that is why they were not known that whether they have got diabetes or not. So during pregnancy, if you classify them separately, then this group of women would be the ones where you would like to screen for chronic complications of diabetes as well. For example, retinopathy and nephropathy. And these are the women who, since they have quite high blood glucose values from the very onset, these are the women who will require insulin from the very beginning of their diagnosis. The other set of women are those women who have pre-existing type 1 or type 2 diabetes. So these are the women who already have diabetes, now entering pregnancy with their background status of our diagnosed diabetes. And there could be other rarer types of diabetes as well, which though not very common, but if those are there, they will be also labeled as having pre-existing diabetes. So what about prevalence of hyperglycemia in pregnancy? Remember, hyperglycemia in pregnancy actually depicts the background prevalence of type 2 diabetes mellitus in a population, and that is very well shown in studies done in Pakistan as well. This is coming from the previous IDF Atlas, because the latest IDF Atlas will be just released, I think, tomorrow, when IDF's International Congress is taking place. They have released few figures but haven't released their full atlas yet. So you can see that in 2019, almost 16% of pregnancies were complicated by some degree of hyperglycemia, and that accounted for more than 20 million live births which were affected because of some degree of hyperglycemia in pregnancy. Out of these, most common were the gestational diabetes mellitus cases, around 84%, and rest were, these were the overt diabetes. So these were the types of diabetes which were detected first time during pregnancy, around 8.5%, and 7.9% were those who already had pre-existing diabetes. And if we look at the age prevalence, you can see that, and we know very well from previous studies and data as well, that as the maternal age increases, the risk of hyperglycemia in pregnancy also increases. So you can see over here that if the percentages were around 10% for a less than 25-year-old group of women, it was quite high at this time, which was where it was almost approaching 25%, 35 to 39 years, and kept on increasing as the maternal age increases. So this is our own data from Aga Khan University Hospital. It's already published in JPMA as a letter to editor. Over here, you can see that we have shown the frequencies of GDM per 100 live births in our patients. So you can see that around the year 2012, later on, the frequencies and prevalence of GDM per 100 live birth continued to increase. And this was the time when we incorporated the IA-DPSG criteria to diagnose and screen our women for GDM. And most of our obstetricians at this stage switched to universal screening practices. Prior to that, it was mostly the high-risk screening practice, but around here, when IA-DPSG criteria was published, and we knew that we could miss patients if we are not using universal screening practices. Universal screening and one-step method was adopted at this time. And later on, you can see that around 20% was prevalence in 2013-14, and then in 2018, it was around close to 20%. And similar figures have been shared by our colleagues from Indus Health Network as well, where they are using universal screening practices and using the IA-DPSG criteria. So does hyperglycemic pregnancy lead to maternal or fetal complications? We know that both in the mom and the baby, there could be problems with hyperglycemia in pregnancy. The mother is at high risk of preeclampsia, and hyperglycemia in pregnancy can lead to higher chances of induction of labor, cesarean section, operative deliveries, and labor complications. And in the fetus, if the fetus is exposed at the early stages of pregnancy in the first trimester to hyperglycemia, there could be congenital defects like defects of the central nervous system and cardiovascular system are most often occurring, while fetal programming can also be impacted. And later on, large for gestational age babies and macrosomia, increased fat mass, increased adiposity is a problem in these fetuses. Similarly, in the neonate, because of LGA or polyhydramnias, if there is chance of premature delivery, preterm delivery, there would be risk of prematurity, perinatal asphyxia, respiratory distress syndrome, and metabolic complications. So neonatal hypoglycemia is something that we worry about a lot, but there could be hypocalcemia, polycythemia, and hyperviscosity as well, and hyperbilirubinemia to an extent that there could be a need of phototherapy in these infants or neonates. In the long term, both mom and the baby are at risk of metabolic complications like type 2 diabetes mellitus and obesity. An infant born to a mother who is having type 1 diabetes would be at a slightly higher risk of type 1 diabetes compared to general population, and metabolic syndrome. And the mother is at risk of cardiovascular disease in future years as well. So we know that we do not like to have the babies to have either small for gestational age or large for gestational age or macrosomia. Actually, the infant should be an appropriate for gestational age baby. And this is what we keep on trying during managing these pregnancies that are complicated by hyperglycemia, to have an appropriate for gestational age infant. So the question is, if we manage GDM, will we be able to improve maternal and neonatal outcomes? And this is a meta-analysis by Horvath, published in BMJ. Over here, there were 3 important parameters. You can see that large for gestational age, macrosomia, and shoulder dystocia. And they looked at whether if we intervene compared to we do not intervene, whether we would be benefiting in terms of these outcomes. And you can see that for all those different studies on LGA, macrosomia, and shoulder dystocia, benefits were seen in intervention groups. So which means that if you intervene for these women in terms of providing the medical nutrition therapy or whenever needed medical pharmacotherapy, they will be helped in terms of their fetal and neonatal outcomes. So I like to share over here one of our patients whom we got referral from the primary obstetrician in our combined maternal diabetes clinic. You can see this was her OGTT, which was done, I think, around 24 weeks of gestation. And at this time, you can see that all the cutoffs were meeting or exceeding the threshold for diagnosing GDM. Initially, she was put on medical nutrition therapy by her primary obstetrician and then added on to metformin because she was not getting control on medical nutrition therapy alone. But later on, the ultrasound, which was done at 27 weeks of gestation, showed, you can see that this is the total abdominal diameter and this is the abdominal circumference of the fetus. And both of these are nearing the 95th centile, which means that the baby is already large for the gestational age and approaching macrosomia as well. So this is large for gestational age baby. Over here, you can say that this is the centile, a growth centile, and this is 84%. Mostly when the growth centile is going above 75 centimeters, and if this exceeds 95 centile, then you label that baby as macrosomia. And over here, you can see that the amniotic fluid index, which is 18.8 cm. And in the report, the operator has written that amniotic fluid volume is at 95th centile. So which means that the baby is having polyhydramnios as well, which is mainly due to the fact that the baby is exposed to high glucose levels and is passing more urine, thus contributing to more fluid, amniotic fluid volume. So at this stage, so remember from endocrine and diabetes point of view, these are the parameters that you would be looking at when you're having their growth scans, the fetus's total abdominal diameter, abdominal circumference, fetal growth centile, and amniotic fluid index. Most often the general reports that we get do not have the centiles mentioned on them, but there are websites which can give you the growth centile if you put these parameters into that. So there's a website by the name of Fetal Medicine Foundation, and over there, if you go, there is parameter for growth, fetal growth, and if you can add these numbers over here, and that will give you the centile. Similarly, most often the amniotic fluid index, if that is going high, the report will be showing that this is polyhydramnia. So which means that the baby is now showing effects of hyperglycemia and exposure to high glucose levels. And this is more of an kind of an urgency during pregnancy, that you have to manage these patients appropriately to achieve better outcomes. And this is a very good time. She is 27 weeks. Your intervention will result in benefits for this fetus. So we actually switched her to this patient to, I think we added insulin for her because she was not getting control on metformin alone. And there was one ultrasound within these 5 weeks, so which showed a normal amniotic fluid index. And then 32 weeks ultrasound, you can see that fetal growth and amniotic fluid index were all normal at this stage. And she delivered a healthy baby later on. So there are lots of diagnostic challenges when it comes to screening and diagnosing GDM. We know that there's a long list of risk factors that can be thought about when you're having a woman. But remember, meta-analysis have shown that these risk factors are actually a poor predictor of appropriately diagnosing GDM. which means that if you rely on risk factor and then screen your patients, you would miss some certain patients or women who would be otherwise having GDM, but since they were not offered screening, that could lead to problems. And especially our side of the world, which is already at high risk of type 2 diabetes, in such populations, universal screening is something that is recommended. So the idea is to screen every pregnant lady. So you will not be screening definitely those who already have pre-gestational diabetes, because these are the ones who need care as hyperglycemic pregnancy from the very onset. Similarly, women who have pre-diabetes are actually GDMs during pregnancy, and they would need monitoring and all medical nutrition therapy and pharmacotherapy earlier on. So they will not again require screening. This is for all those women who are entering pregnancy, knew either their glycemic status, they did not had any GDM in past, or did not had any glucose abnormalities in the past, or did not know whether they have any glucose abnormalities. So all those have to be screened. Okay, so and the screening, when to screen is important. That so at the first antenatal visit, the one-step oral glucose tolerance test with 75 gram glucose load should be offered. And this is if the patient is presenting to you before 24 weeks of gestation. So at any time before 24 weeks of gestation, if she is presented in early gestation, yes, that is the opportunity that you can screen her for any pre-existing diabetes or pre-diabetes by screening her during pregnancy, and then managing her as a GDM or over diabetes mellitus in pregnancy. And if at that stage her screening test comes out to be negative or normal, then these women need to be rescreened at 24 to 28 weeks of gestation again. Remember the human chorionic somatotrophin's effect on glycemic status and glucose antagonizing effect of human chorionic somatotrophin at this stage of pregnancy. This is that stage when you have to rescreen if your initial screening was negative. However, if you have diagnosed them as GDM or pre-gestational or over diabetes mellitus in pregnancy, you will manage them as hyperglycemia in pregnancy. Okay, so these are the cutoffs. So, and the cutoffs actually coming from a very large HAPO study, the hyperglycemic pregnancy outcome study, which was published in NEJM. And I will request all of you to please go through, read that document. How did they come to these cutoffs when International Association of Diabetes and Pregnancy Study Groups use that data to develop these cutoffs. So fasting plasma glucose 92, 1R 180, and 2R 153. So any value meeting or exceeding this threshold is labeled as GDM. Remember, HbA1c is not recommended for diagnosis of GDM because we know that A1c is universally not available, especially the one that the standardized assay that can be used for diagnosing diabetes. Number two, we do not know what should be the ideal cutoffs during pregnancy to diagnose somebody as GDM. And number three, HbA1c has a lot of limitations when it comes to conditions which increase red cell turnover, like iron deficiency, anemia. There could be falsely elevated A1c. Similarly, certain hemoglobinopathies can lead to falsely low HbA1c. So keeping that in mind, and the fact that we do not have cutoffs for during pregnancy for GDM established, this is not recommended for diagnosis of GDM. How will you label somebody as having over diabetes mellitus in pregnancy? So remember, just any those cutoffs which are used to diagnose diabetes in non-pregnant individuals. So cutoff of fasting plasma glucose 126 or more, or 2-hour post glucose load 200 or more, and over here HbA1c of 6.5 or more. You can label these women as having over diabetes mellitus in pregnancy, keeping in mind that these are the women who might already had GDM, did not know that they had GDM, or might be having pre-diabetes before pregnancy and were not aware of that status. So there are certain caveats. You might come across women who are PCOS and are on metformin for miscarriage prevention in their early gestation. In those women, and we know that PCOS group of women are those who are actually at a very high risk of GDM, and they will need some kind of screening. So what is recommended that during the first trimester, either one can go for fasting plasma glucose or maybe a glucose series, which will include fasting plasma glucose and 2-hour post glucose values for all 3 main meals. And if those are normal, then you need to rescreen them at this stage of pregnancy, 15 to 16 weeks, when you can safely stop metformin for at least a week, and then you get their OGTTs done. If screening at this stage is negative, then you rescreen them at 28 weeks of gestation. There would be another subset of women who are unable to tolerate 75-gram glucose load. They would throw up at every time you try to them to have this glucose load. For them, glucose series is something that is recommended for screening. And then there could be another situation where either the woman has presented late. So a woman is booking and making an antenatal booking after 28 weeks of gestation, or there would be another woman who had normal OGTT between 24 to 28 weeks of gestation, but later on her fetal growth scan in the 3rd trimester started showing macrosomia or polyhydramnios. In those situations, it's recommended that a glucose series or SMBGs need to be done. Okay, so how would you manage GDM? The cornerstones are these: medical nutrition therapy, exercise, and self-monitoring of blood glucose. These are essentials which will be applicable to all women of hypoglycemia and pregnancy. Medical nutrition therapy, the goals are simple. We want to achieve a good glycemic control, but at the same time avoid starvation and prevent ketosis, because we do not want them to be starving. Otherwise, they will go into a state of ketosis, and ketone bodies are not a very good fuel for the developing fetus. The medical nutrition therapy should be able to provide adequate weight gain, and the weight gain guidelines are again developed by Institution of Medicine for each trimester of pregnancy, and depending upon their pre-pregnancy weight as well, and should be able to contribute to fetal well-being. So starvation is not something that should be done during pregnancy. They should be eating according to their appetite or hunger, but their quality of meals have to be modified. So what we encourage is the low glycemic index carbohydrates, vegetables, or full grain bread. Carbohydrate restrictions below 40% is not recommended of the total daily calorie requirement. At least 175 grams per day carbohydrate should be there in their meals, and it's important to teach them at least about the basic carbohydrate counting. So they should be able to understand that an item made out of the white flour would lead to more increments in their glycemic levels, glucose levels, compared to a whole wheat or whole grain bread. Similarly, the meals have to be distributed throughout the day to 3 main meals and 2 to 4 snacks, and making sure that there's a bedtime snack, and keeping their overnight fast period of less than 8 hours. During pregnancy, we do not want them to be fasting beyond 8 hours overnight. And then again, they have to avoid fasts and feasts, especially and no sweet treats. So fasting in a woman who is having pregnancy complicated by hyperglycemia puts her and the fetus at a higher risk. Similarly, if she takes feast or takes sweet treats, that will lead to a post-meal highs, which are actually have a direct link to fetal macrosomia. So you can see that the food plate, which is recommended for patients with diabetes in general, can be used to teach a pregnant woman about the healthy food plate that they should be taking. Regarding exercise, remember there could be certain obstetric contraindications to walking or exercise, so those have to be considered in mind. But walking is a simple exercise. If there aren't any contraindication, that can be done. And if there are contraindications to walking, then upper body ergometric exercises. So most often we ask our patients to use stretch bands or hand grips, or maybe lighter weight dumbbells, or do just keep on moving their hands and arms so that their muscles contract and relax, and muscle contraction will lead to better glycemic control. For all other women who do not have an obstetric contraindication, even if they do not have hyperglycemia in pregnancy, they are encouraged to continue their pre-pregnancy activity. But at the same time, keep in mind that they should not be starting a new vigorous exercise during pregnancy. The glycemic targets are tighter for a pregnant lady, and that is because those targets are meant to achieve a good fetal neonatal outcome. And through various studies, we know that these are the thresholds which are safe for the fetus. Anything above these will lead to macrosomia and polyhydramnios. And this is something that we keep on striving for throughout pregnancy at each week of gestation, that we want to keep them within goals. So fasting below 92, some will say below 90 or below 95, but not above 95 is something that is recommended. If you're going for a 2-hour postprandial values, those should be below 120. In certain situations, you might opt to choose testing for 1 hour rather than the 2-hour value. And for the 1-hour value, 140 is the threshold. Timing and frequency of self-monitoring of blood glucose would vary from a patient to patient. So there isn't a one-size-fit-all approach, and that will be dependent upon the diagnosis. So if there's a woman with type 1 diabetes, she will need something like 6 to 10 monitoring per day, compared to another GDM woman who is only controlled on medical nutrition therapy. Only 2 to 3 time values per day might suffice for her. Similarly, stage of pregnancy. So in early gestation and in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy, frequent monitoring is needed. In the early trimester, we know that is the period of fetal organogenesis, and the late trimester where growth is an issue. At that stages, you will need very frequent monitoring of blood glucose. Similarly, if there's hypoglycemia awareness or not. So in somebody who is hypoglycemia unaware, you will need more frequent testing. And if there's evidence of polyhydramnios or fetal macrosomia on fetal growth scan, again, further increasing monitoring is needed. At the same time, make sure that the glucometer is giving accurate readings, because you're relying on these readings throughout gestation to give them pharmacotherapy, adjust their insulin doses. The accuracy generally we check by comparing the glucometer values to the lab values. So their capillary blood glucose values on the meter, and at the same time their venous plasma sample. And if there's a difference of within 10 milligram per DL between the two readings, then that glucometer is considered to be accurate. If the difference is more than 10 milligram per DL, then it's better that either they get their meters calibrated or buy a new one, and then recheck and recompare their values with the lab values. Increasingly, we are coming to know about the continuous glucose monitoring devices, which are not available in Pakistan. And you should be offering these devices to your type 1 diabetes patients wherever they can afford this, or you can source this for them, because CGMs have actually showed that for type 1s, those are really beneficial. For CGM, the target range you will set as between 63 and 140 during pregnancy for either type 1, type 2, or GDMs. Most of the CGMs will not let you go below 70 milligram per DL in their settings. So over there, you can keep it as 70 to 140. And you will want them, so time in targets, so that is the 63 to 140 milligram per DL. More than 70% of the values should be lying within this range. And you will want to have lesser hypoglycemias or time below range spent, less than 4% below 63 and less than 1% below 54, and again less than 25% above range value. So which means that for around 17 hours a day, you will want them to be within the target range. You will see that when your patient starts using these CGMs, since they're better able to visualize their glucose levels round the clock, and they are able to adjust their insulin doses accordingly, they are able to achieve better time in range, and encourage them that each 5% increase in time in range. So if they were somewhere around 40% in time of range, even if they have brought that time in range to 45%, that will increase the benefits for both mother and the baby. So coming to pharmacotherapy, when will you consider pharmacotherapy in GDMs? When medical nutrition therapy results in inadequate glucose control, when there's lack of expected weight gain as a result of too much calorie restriction, when the patients are consistently hungry, and if there is evidence of large for gestational age baby on the ultrasound. So this is a table that actually suggests that what kind of therapies and how much time you can give to non-pharmacotherapy and then proceed to pharmacotherapy. So if the patient is having over diabetes mellitus in pregnancy, we already discussed this. This is the patient who would need both non-pharmacological treatment and pharmacological treatment from the very onset of their diagnosis. For these women who are moderate in their glycemic levels, so fasting 110 to 126 and 1 to 125, and 2 hour post glucose load 140 to 199. Over there, maybe you can offer them a little bit of the medical nutrition therapies effect, but it's better. And keep in mind that these are the women who will require pharmacotherapy very soon. For women who have lesser than these values, these are the women who can be kept on medical nutrition therapy for almost a week. And then if they are getting well into control, you can continue just medical nutrition therapy and exercise and SMBGs for them. But if they're not able to achieve control within a week, then you will have to progress to pharmacotherapy. Similarly, as pregnancy progresses, we know that if a woman was controlled on non-pharmacotherapy for a couple of weeks, might require pharmacotherapy when she's around 32 or 33 weeks of gestation, which means that these women will need continuous follow-ups with their primary attending as well. And then what kind of therapy is beneficial? So we know that insulin is the preferred treatment option for managing any degree of hyperglycemia in pregnancy. But for last almost more than a decade, we are aware that there are certain oral agents that can be used as well. But those have to be, again, considered on case-to-case basis, depending upon the stage of pregnancy, the glucose levels that they had on their diagnostic test, and what kind of ultrasounds they were having. So insulin is the preferred treatment for this kind of levels, but metformin can be an alternative. And in second and third trimester, you can consider metformin, but insulin should be preferred if there is history of polyhydramnios or preeclampsia in that pregnancy. Similarly, for these levels, fasting plasma glucose of more than 110 and 2 hour post glucose load of more than 140. Insulin should be the preferred treatment, and one can either add metformin as well to these women if there is evidence of increasing evidence of insulin resistance. So if they're overweight and obese women, or alternatively, if the insulin requirements are going more than 2 units per kg per day, that can be considered as well. So these are the different insulins that are safe to use in pregnancy. Human insulin is regular, and NPH can be safely used in pregnancy. For Aspart and Lispro as short-acting analog can be safely used during pregnancy. For long-acting analog, Detamir has an RCT to support its use during pregnancy. However, for Glargine, although they is considered as category C for pregnancy, but it's recommended that if a woman is already controlled on Glargine pre-conception, especially a woman with type 1 diabetes, you will continue Glargine during pregnancy. Okay, so how will you write an insulin prescription? And remember, whenever you start insulin in a pregnant woman, all those things that you do for your non-pregnant population, teaching them insulin techniques, insulin storage, how to adjust their insulin doses according to their self-monitoring of blood glucose, charting, hypoglycemia identification and management. And when they're coming for follow-up, look at the insulin injection sites. So this is the algorithm over here. You can see that if despite optimal medical nutrition therapy and metformin, the blood glucose targets are not met, or if the patient is having over diabetes mellitus from the very onset, you will start insulin therapy. So for when fasting plasma glucose is above target, you will start basal insulin. That could be either through NPH or Detamir. And the total daily dose is initially calculated as 0.1 to 0.2 unit per kg per day. Glycemic goal will be less than 92 milligram per DL. And you have to keep on up titrating the insulin dose every 48 hours to 72 hours if the fasting blood glucose is not within the target range. If hypoglycemia occurs, then the dose need to be reduced, and you have to teach your patients about this thing, how to self-adjust their insulin doses and what to do in case of hypoglycemia, how to reduce their insulin doses. For those women who have high postprandial values, if the post-meal values, 2 hour post-meal values are staying above 120, then despite the fact, besides the fact that they have to be more vigilant in terms of their medical nutrition therapy and exercise, they will need prandial insulin coverage through 0.1 to 0.15 unit per kg per meal dosing before the largest meal or before the meal with highest post-meal excursion. But if all 3 meals are showing high post-meal values, then you will be starting this for all 3 meals from the very onset. And then keep on up titrating the insulin units every 48 hours or 72 hours till the random blood glucose comes in the target range. And if hypoglycemia occurs, then you have to reduce their insulin doses. Remember, for somebody who is presenting with over diabetes mellitus in pregnancy and is in early gestation, where you are worrying a lot about their embryopathy in the baby, you can consider up titrating the insulin doses at a higher numbers compared to what we generally do for our GDMs. So these are the kind of the modified ACE algorithm for non-pregnant individuals that we have adopted for pregnant women. And we have seen that through such kind of algorithms where you keep on escalating numbers based upon their self-monitored blood glucose values, they are able to bring themselves to target really soon. Okay, so during pregnancy, remember, this was the time when the effect of the insulin antagonizing hormones of pregnancy are maximum. And over here, there is a chance that the insulin requirements will continue to go up remarkably. And then it plateaus at around 35 to 36 weeks of gestation. So keeping this in mind, you will be able to adjust the insulin doses and will be able to counsel your patients to keep on escalating the insulin doses themselves as well. Okay, what about the use of oral anti-diabetic agents in pregnancy? We know that metformin through the MIG trial, the data, and then various studies later on have shown that metformin is safe during pregnancy, can be used although it crosses the placenta and reaches the fetus in minimal amounts. However, till now, no significant adverse effects on the fetal outcome studies have been, and children born to the women who were treated with metformin has been found. The other drug is the glibenclamide, which could be used, but remember, this is a drug that can lead to hypoglycemia and has been shown to be clearly inferior to insulin and metformin in GDM through very much published meta-analysis. Whenever we are starting oral agents, remember that there is a chance of failure of these agents, and we should be upgrading to insulin or adding or supplementing insulin really soon rather than waiting with uncontrolled numbers. So this is a recently published network meta-analysis of use of gleburide, which is actually glibenclamide, metformin, and insulin use in GDM, glycemic control and neonatal outcomes. And for this was on more than 4,000 women from 23 trials. It was shown that metformin resulted in better postprandial control compared to gleburide and lower neonatal hypoglycemia, preeclampsia compared to insulin. And so both these neonatal hypoglycemia and preeclampsia were lesser, but there was small for gestational age babies, chances were high. Maternal weight gain was also lower compared to the insulin treated group. So the conclusion was that metformin may be as effective as insulin for glycemic control and is the most promising drug for prevention of neonatal and maternal complications. Another MIGHTY trial published for type 2 diabetes mellitus in pregnancy, that is again a multi-center international randomized placebo-controlled trial, which included more than 500 women. Half of them were randomized to metformin arm and other half to placebo arm. And the metformin treated women achieved better glycemic control, required less insulin dosing per day. So you can see that 1.12 in the metformin treated group compared to 1.5 unit per kg per day in the placebo treated group. These mothers gained less weight compared to the control group. There were fewer cesarean births as well in the metformin treated group, fewer large for gestational age, and reduced adiposity measures in the infant. But there was a higher chance of small for gestational age babies in the metformin treated women. So the average weight of infants born to metformin treated moms were 3.1 kg compared to 3.3 kg in the placebo-treated group. The conclusion was that several maternal, glycemic, and neonatal adiposity benefits were seen in the metformin group, along with reduced maternal weight gain and insulin dosage and improved glycemic control. The lower adiposity and infant height measurements resulted in fewer large for gestational age babies, but a higher proportion of small for gestational age infants. So again, highlighting the fact that the decision to use metformin should be individualized from case-to-case basis. So what we do in our clinical practice is that if there is any evidence of intrauterine growth restriction, we do not continue with metformin and switch those women to insulin, despite the fact that if they were well controlled on metformin already. So a little bit about preconception care of women with pre-existing diabetes. Poor glycemic control can lead to increased risk of malformations and spontaneous abortion. You can see that something more than 9% A1C, more than 10% of risk of these things, and it increases exponentially as the A1C worsens in the preconception period. So timing of malformation is actually very narrow. So you can see that 3 to 6 weeks post-ovulation, a major central nervous system and cardiovascular defects can occur. And that is why one should be aiming for HbA1c below 7% and ideally less than 6.5% in your women who have pre-existing diabetes, and folic acid supplementation prior to pregnancy. And that is why discussing their conception plans and advising them in preconception counseling is very important for all women with diabetes who are in the reproductive age bracket. So preconception counseling in glycemic control and screen for complications would include a good counseling, modifying their drugs according to the ones which are safe in pregnancy. If they're overweight, control their weight. Their blood pressure should be controlled on safer agents. Similarly, for your type 1 diabetes patients, their thyroid status should be known. And if that is impaired, they should be on replacement therapies. Similarly, foot assessment, because if there's neuropathy, that can be a problem during pregnancy. Knowing their nephropathy status, if there is, by testing their creatinine and albumin to creatinine ratio, and stabilizing nephropathy before letting them pregnant. And similarly, and so that is important that during the time when you're achieving preconception control and stabilization of all these complications, the woman should be using effective contraception so as to avoid any unplanned pregnancy. Similarly, their retinal assessment, because if there is a retinal involvement during pregnancy, such kind of retina can progress to really sight-threatening retinopathy because of the fact that the hormonal changes in pregnancy and the fact that if she was poorly controlled and you're trying to achieve good control very rapidly, that can again enhance and aggravate retinopathy. So you do not want them to go into this stage. Similarly, hypertension and dyslipidemia, remember most of the agents that you routinely use in a non-pregnant population are contraindicated during pregnancy and should be avoided. So insulin requirements in type 1 diabetes in pregnancy, between 8 to 14 weeks of gestation, her insulin requirements usually fall. So this is somebody who is well controlled, when controlled type 1 diabetes now entering pregnancy. Between 8 to 14 weeks of gestation, her insulin requirements will go down because of the fact that this is insulin sensitive stage, and owing to the nausea and vomiting of pregnancy, she might be eating less, but afterwards her insulin requirements continue to go up. So you can see that if she was using something like 45 units per day before conception, she will go on to something like more than 2 to 3 times her requirements at late gestation. And this at 35 to 36 weeks, her requirements either plateau or reduced by 10%. And if there is more than 15% reduction in insulin requirements, then that should be a criteria to screen the baby for any evidence of placental insufficiency. So monitoring the baby, dating ultrasound, nuchal translucency in selected group of women, fetal anomaly scan, echocardiography is important because especially in all your women who either had pre-existing diabetes or had early onset GDM or over diabetes mellitus in pregnancy, they should undergo fetal echocardiography to look for any cardiac defects that might necessitate involvement of the pediatric neonatal cardiac services as well. And then growth scans 28 weeks and onwards growth scan should be done. And there's a role of fetal biophysical profile and umbilical Doppler studies at later pregnancy as well. Remember that more vigilance is required during first and third trimester. We have already discussed this. And for most of your women who had early onset GDM or having pre-diabetes, pre-existing diabetes, pre-gestational diabetes, or over diabetes mellitus in pregnancy, they will need aspirin, low dose aspirin for preeclampsia prevention, starting before 16 weeks of gestation. Similarly, keep in mind that hypoglycemia is occurring during mid to late third trimester. So are actually could be the first sign of placental insufficiency and may warrant more vigilant fetal monitoring and may warrant early delivery if there is evidence of any fetal compromise. Factors influencing timing of delivery. So whether you'll be going for early term delivery or term delivery, that will depend on various factors, including if there's a bad obstetric history, you will go for earlier delivery in these women. Similarly, if there's obstetric factors like if there's macrosomia or intrauterine growth restriction or compromised fetal maturity, loss of fetal movements, again, you will go for early delivery. And then medical factors like if the diabetes is increasingly staying uncontrolled, if there's retinal or complications or nephropathy or compromised cardiovascular health, you might want to deliver them before 39 weeks of gestation. Generally, you do not want them to deliver before 37 weeks of gestation because you would like them to have attained enough of lung maturity to be able to breathe on their own. But however, there could be certain situations where you might need to be delivering them before 37 weeks. And in that situation, you will need to give them antenatal glucocorticoids for achieving fetal lung maturity. So during labor, again, it's important to keep blood glucose within control. So within 70 to 126 milligram per DL is something that is recommended. And these women all women during labor need dextrose infusions to meet the high energy requirements of labor. Blood glucose should be tested frequently. And if those are going higher, and for all your type 1 diabetes women, insulin infusion separate from the dextrose water infusion should be utilized. For postpartum care, encourage and support early breastfeeding. Most GDMs will have normal glucose levels postpartum and do not need any treatment or medical nutrition therapy. Contraception is something that should be advised to these women because whenever they plan next pregnancy, they should be in adequate metabolic control before trying to conceive. For your type 2 diabetes women, mostly there will be either reduction or omission of insulin, but they can continue metformin or even glibenclamide during breastfeeding. These two are safe during breastfeeding. And for your type 1s, generally the insulin requirements sharply reduced just after delivery, to an extent that maybe for 12 to 14 hours, they might not need any additional insulin, but since they're type 1s, they will eventually require insulin. But the insulin requirements will reduce compared to what they were taking in the pre-conception period. And they would be at risk of hypoglycemia, so they should be counseled accordingly as well. For your GDMs, remember those who have normal glucose levels post-delivery, they need to undergo OGTT 6 to 12 weeks after delivery. And if those are having normal glucose tolerance at this stage, then OGTT should be repeated every 3 years. Maybe earlier on if she's planning next pregnancy or if she has gained weight during that time. If the OGTT is showing type 2 diabetes, then she should be referred to diabetologist or endocrinologist for further care. And if there is evidence of pre-diabetes, then OGTT should be offered every year. Remember, there is a risk of GDM in subsequent pregnancy, which is 30 to 60% in these women. So type 2 diabetes more than 5 years post GDM, this is again a meta-analysis. You can see that the 20% women almost develop GDM 5 years postpartum, and then around 10 years is close to 75% of type 2 diabetes. And GDM actually predicts a 2 times higher risk of cardiovascular disease as well, which is irrespective of the incident type 2 diabetes. So if the woman hasn't developed type 2 diabetes in post GDM years, she is still at twice the higher risk of cardiovascular disease compared to the age matched women. So this is a take-home message. GDM is common and is associated with significant maternal and perinatal morbidity and mortality. We should be screening all pregnant women for GDM, offer medical nutrition therapy, exercise, and SMBGs to all women with GDM, offer pharmacological treatment when desired glycemic targets are not achieved on medical nutrition therapy and exercise alone. Pregnancies which are complicated by GDM is actually high-risk pregnancy and should be managed by a team of obstetrician, maternal medicine specialist, and endocrinologist, diabetologist with interest in managing GDM pregnancies. With good glycemic control, maternal, fetal, and neonatal adverse outcomes are lowered considerably. And postpartum diabetes risk reduction strategies play a vital role in future diabetes prevention in post-GDM women. So pregnancy actually offers a cost-effective window of opportunity to provide maternal care services to reduce the traditional maternal and perinatal morbidity and mortality indicators, and at the same time address intergenerational prevention of non-communicable diseases such as diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and stroke. So we are aware of glycemia in pregnancy, but we know that there is a high risk of underlying cardiovascular disease risk factor profile in these women, which should be addressed through public health initiatives, and community health sciences should be working on these projects as well. So these are different references which you can use to further read the topic. SOGP has published its guideline early this year as well. And we have been collaborating, as Dr. Zareen has already mentioned, through the Serenity project with SOGP to disseminate these guidances to healthcare professionals so that the care and screening practices should become standardized across the country. Thank you very much for your patient listening.
Thank you so much, madam. This was such a nice and comprehensive overview for me as well. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to hear you for this topic. So before I move on to question answer session for my attendees, I think I'll just quickly go through the questions post lecture poll again. Again, I'm launching the post lecture poll and I encourage all the attendees to now kindly participate in that and make your corrections before, as you might have, opted earlier. Maybe you are wrong, because I could see many of you who are opting all three options in several of the questions. So now I expect that all of you would give 100% right answer. I'm not going to call out the questions again. I'm just running the poll for you. So I think after 2 minutes, I'm going to end the poll. So I encourage all the participants. Meanwhile, you can put in your questions in the question answer box. That will be more helpful for us to gather maximum questions. So I think there are 2 questions there, but okay, I can take another minute, and I can see 11 participants have completed their question polls. And now I can see there's difference. So 70% of the participants should be, attempting the questions. I can see 58%. It's good for you to revise. It's very good. Okay. Still there are, some confusions. So 75% have done. That's great. Let me end the poll and now I'll go through the answers. I'll share the results later. So the first question was, following is true for fetal energy source during pregnancy. And Dr. Aisha has the first slide of her lecture was very much of the answer. So the answer is glucose and amino acids. 86% have done right. How will you screen gestational diabetes in early pregnancy? very clear lecture, message from the lecture. 91% of you are now having good concept of OGTT 0, 1, 2 hour. Very good. Question number 3 is, of course, obesity. Yes, this is the long-term complication which is expected in the baby of the mother. Okay, question number 4 seems quite confusing for you. So the correct answer is medical nutrition therapy. You have to, go according to the management guideline as Madam has explained, right? You can always look back and add medical therapies like metformin and insulin. And then question number 5, and again, all of you have done a great job. Very good. 75-gram OGTT, very good. So there's no point in sharing the results, but now I'm putting this off. So, Madam, we have a few questions. There's a question that if a lady is diagnosed with diabetes for the first time, and even if CBGs are high, I don't know what does that CBG mean. If this is Dr. S.
Capillary blood glucose.
Okay, capillary blood glucose. Okay. How can we say it's a word and not GDM?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ehtasham, for your question. So remember, we do not encourage using capillary blood glucose for diagnosis of diabetes. It's better that you use the venous plasma sample. And I have shown you the cutoffs of how will you diagnose somebody as having GDM versus over diabetes mellitus in pregnancy. So you can use those cutoffs. If you're working in a situation where getting a venous plasma sample is not possible, then make sure that if you're using the capillary blood glucose, that is through a very accurate and very good glucometer. Generally, it's not a very good idea to use glucometers for diagnostic purposes. These are for monitoring purposes, but for diagnosis, it's better that you use venous plasma sample.
Okay. Then another question is, which patients need 1 hour postprandial BSL checking? That is again blood sugar level checking.
Dr. Ijaz, thank you for your question. Generally remember that the threshold that we have is for the 1 hour value and the 2 hour value. If you look at the normal physiology of at what time the blood glucose rises in the postprandial state in a pregnant woman is actually at 90 minutes. We do not have a cutoff established for 90 minutes cutoff. So what is done is that you can use either of these, so either 1 hour or 2 hour. In our practice, we generally tend to use the 2 hour value. And remember the 2 hour value, even for a pregnant or non-pregnant person, the time 0 is the first bite of food. So from that time, you calculate the time 2 hour value. But in those patients where the fasting and 2 hour values are apparently totally normal, but the fetal growth scan is showing evidence of macrosomia or polyhydramnias, in that situation, we opt for the 1 hour value as well, because sometimes there could be a 1 hour spike that is occurring, and at the 2 hour, the numbers are fine, but 1 hour values are higher than 140 milligram per dl. In such situations, wherever you can get the help of CGMs is also important, that if apparently your patient's blood glucose numbers, which is tested through an accurate glucometer, are within normal ranges, but there is still an evidence of fetal macrosomia or polyhydramnias, then you go for CGM as well, if that can be arranged for your patient. Okay.
Yes, madam. I think this was a very important question that Dr. Ijaz did, because even in my practice, when I joined Dow University, the gynae department, ops department, they used to do 1 hour monitoring. Then it was always a 1 hour monitoring, but they didn't, I was having confusion that how to, collaborate with them about this. Then later on, I tried to sort it out.
Yeah, it's totally fine if your gynecologist is more comfortable using the 1 hour value, then you can tune yourself up for the 1 hour value as well. So it's totally okay. That can be.
Even in Oxford, when we did our electives in Oxford, even they used to do 1 hour monitoring. So then I realized that this is because maybe most of them are, trained from UK. So that's why. Okay, there's a question from Dr. Khalil. Can we use HbA1c instead of OGTT after 12 weeks of delivery in GDM patient? Is there any head-to-head trial for that? Okay.
Yes, Dr. Khalil. So there are studies on this aspect, but the conclusion from those studies as well is that HbA1c is not an ideal test to diagnose GDM because you will not be able to, I would say, that rule out with certainty that the patient is not having GDM, which means that the specificity is low for this test. Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Dr. Anam wants to know more about the intrapartum management of GDM. I think it should be a separate lecture. It's not easy to, answer this question.
For
So-
intrapartum GDM, mostly GDMs will not require insulin infusions during labor because the contracting uterus is utilizing so much of fuel from the mother that their blood glucose levels hardly go up. But your type 1s will require insulin infusion, and those type 2s who were already on high insulin requirements during pregnancy might need that insulin infusion during labor as well. But the cutoffs that I've shown, 70 to 126 numbers, are actually meant to prevent or avoid neonatal hypoglycemia that can otherwise occur if the blood glucose thresholds for labor were not met during labor. And that is for labor. So if the patient is going for a cesarean section takes hardly 10 to 15 minutes maybe. So over there, the problem would not be such. But for labor, where we know that there would be hours of uterine contractions and labor progressing through first stage and then second stage and third stage, over there you need to be vigilant to control their glucose levels.
Okay, I think I'll take this one last question because some questions seems repetitive. When the pregnant lady come to the OPD first time after 20 weeks of gestation and diagnosed with diabetes, how we differentiate GDM or overt diabetes? Again, a bit repetitive, but if you can just elaborate once again.
Okay, so when you're doing the OGDT, it's the cutoffs, the thresholds that will differentiate between whether CDM and overt diabetes mellitus in pregnancy. You cannot tell with certainty whether this woman had pre-existing diabetes, which you can only check after she delivers. But being overt diabetes mellitus in pregnancy, she will need very vigilant care, monitoring, and pharmacotherapy, including insulin from the very onset.
Okay, I think that's it. And thank you so much, Dr. Aisha, for your kind.
Just one moment, because one of the questions was about the Fetal Medicine Foundation website that
जी वो I have मैंने वो reply कर दिया. Fetal Medicine Foundation है ना मैडम?
हाँ, if I can share the screen क्योंकि वो मैंने खोली भी है. So this is the screen. Dr. Ijaz, I think you were asking about this. So this is the fetalmedicine.org, and over here you can see the calculators, and this is the fetal growth. This calculator is something that will help you know the growth centile. If the report, mostly our reports do not show growth centile. So here you'll write the gestational age, then head circumference, abdominal circumference, and femur length, and this will give you centiles over here, and estimated fetal weight, and then the growth centile in general. So this is, and it will show it over here in the graph as well. So through this, you will know that whether this is a large for gestational age baby or small for gestational age baby or macrosomic or intrauterine growth restriction. Okay.
Thank you, madam. ये तो बहुत ज़बरदस्त था. Thank you so much. I would request Professor Akhtar Ali Baloch sir kindly give your comments so then we can conclude the session today.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum.
वालेकुम अस्सलाम.
बिस्मिल्लाहिर्रहमानिर्रहीम. अल्लाह के नाम से शुरू जो निहायत मेहरबान और रहम करने वाला है. लाखों करोड़ों दुरूद आप सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम पर जो पूरी कायनात के लिए रहमत बना के भेजे. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Aisha Sheikh for her wonderful teaching talk today, and I really enjoyed it. Very comprehensive, very informative, and very excellent. And I'm sure she's a great teacher. And today's talk will improve our understanding about the diagnosis and management of the gestational diabetes. And I learned a lot, many things today. And I'm sure that all the participants and the fellows who've taken the exams. It will be very good support for them. And I'm grateful to her that Sunday, especially, which is a holiday, she taken off some time, spared some precious time for today's teaching session, which is really very great. And hopefully, inshallah, we will invite her again in future of our activities. And thank you, madam, for coming along and for such a wonderful teaching session today. Thank you so much. Inshallah, we'll see you and we will invite you again in our future activities. I'm sure you will not disappoint us. And I would like to thank to my faculty for their kind support always. They're there to help us to organize this course. And of course, the Bet Hassan for their support. Without their support, it was not possible to surface this course. And I would like to thank all the participants as well for their interest they have shown, and they have attended the lecture. And I'm sure they, whatever a number of the candidates we had to attend the lectures, which were delivered by very senior teachers, professors, and experts in their fields. And I'm sure all the participants they have enjoyed, and they might have learned a lot of things which I'm sure you know, and will help them to improve their understanding and management in field of endocrinology. And for them, I would like to request them again to fill in the feedback form. And I also would like to inform that we are intending to hold the clinical course, one-day clinical course, hand-on practice, one-day short cases and talks. So anyone who is interested, they can contact us. We will organize the air tickets and the one-day stay in the hotel. And thank you so much, Zareen, for your help. All faculty members, but especially Zareen, she was the backbone and she worked a lot to hold this course, and she was contacting everybody, and they took a pen to hold the course and for our fellows. So all the fellows must appreciate the efforts of this institute and especially Zareen. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. They were so kind words. Thank you. I am honored. Thank you once again, madam, for your kind contribution.
Thank you.
We hope to see you next week, and all those fellows who will be participating in the practical course. We're going to see you all, and inshallah we'll keep in touch with all the attendees who are not fellows but who have regularly participated in our course. Wish you have a nice weekend. I mean, the rest of the Sunday. See you again. Allah Hafiz. Thank you, madam. Allah Hafiz.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Akhtar. And thank you, Zareen. Allah Hafiz. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.